Hi, I'm Micah Halpern. Thank you for joining me today as I do some thinking out loud. Our first segment is called Background Briefing. The very first thing I've been thinking about is the Iran deal. Israeli Prime Minister Yair Lapid made it very clear, on the record and in private conversations, that he is not opposed to a nuke deal with Iran. Lapid is opposed to this nuke deal with Iran. From the perspective of Israel, the nuke deal circa 2022, that's this one, is extremely dangerous to their survival, and so for the entire world. Israeli leadership has taken a far different approach to this deal with Iran than they did in 2015, when the original deal was composed, configured, and signed. This time around, Jerusalem actively talked, negotiated, and made their objections very clear to the Biden administration. And the Biden administration paid attention. In fact, several of Israel's objections have been incorporated into U.S. requirements for the deal before it can be signed. And several have not. In 2015, things were very different. Benjamin Netanyahu was Prime Minister of Israel, and Barack Obama was President of the United States. That relationship can best be described as cantankerous, problematic. Netanyahu was not a big fan of Obama, and Barack Obama felt the same way about Bibi. Polite, yes, but tinged with belligerence. It's not surprising, then, that Israel's objections as the deal was being cobbled together were downright ignored by the United States. While Israel was never invited to the negotiating table, Israel knows the details of the deal. Of course they do. The first of Israel's notable objections were over Iran's insistence that the Revolutionary Guard Corps be removed from the U.S. list of terror groups. The second is Iran's desire to gloss over all open cases of their IAEA, International Atomic Energy Agency, violations. Israel explained why that would be very dangerous, and the United States heard, understood, and stood their ground in adopting Israel's recommendations for changes. The IRGC is now an integrated part of the agreement. And then Iran backed down as a result of it, and they too accepted the change. As for Israel's second objection, despite the IAEA demands, Iran has removed many of the watchdog's cameras, making monitoring nuclear activities and the shenanigans around it difficult at best, oftentimes impossible. Dozens of monitoring issues need to be clarified, and according to Israel, and no deal should not be closed until the issues are resolved. That caveat was also accepted by the U.S. and added into the pre-agreement, but not by Iran. Style, nuance, tone are all very important in the art of diplomacy. They are even more important than being correct. That was a hard lesson learned by Netanyahu when even the very valid Israeli objections were ignored in 2015 by the United States. In 2022, Lapid is insisting that Israel is working very hard with, not against, Washington, and Washington is listening. On the other hand, David Dadi Barnea, the head of Israel's Mossad, their clandestine services, was rather less diplomatic. Barnea does not have to be diplomatic. He's a spy. Barnea maintains that this new Iran deal will destabilize the region, and that is a big mistake. He explains that Iran has lied and cheated about their nuclear ambitions, that the reason they want nuclear capabilities is to distribute them and to threaten the region, especially Israel. Iran thrives on keeping their hands clean by designating proxies to do their dirty work. Barnea further explains that Iran's ultimate objective, which would be obtained through this nuclear deal, it is to attain a bomb, and the deal, when configured to their desires and demands, will give them permission to do just that. So of course Iran wants a deal. Barnea further explains that Israel is working very hard to make certain that Iran does not reach a nuclear threshold whereby Tehran is capable of assembling a nuclear weapon for themselves or for anyone else. According to Barnea, and this is a quote, "Our commitment remains, regardless of any deal, They are signing a similar deal to the one signed in 2015, but the world has changed. The Iranians have developed advanced centrifuges, and the threats and technologies are different, unquote. Barnea is correct. So why is the United States so bent on enabling Iran? This administration, like the administration of Barack Obama, Joe Biden's mentor and thought leader, does not understand the nature of the Iranian threat. It's an unfortunate and hard to grapple with truth. The United States is incapable, America in general is incapable of grasping the life and death nature of an agreement that may go wrong with Iran. They think of it not in terms of life and death, but like any other bad agreement, or an agreement that goes awry. The United States is playing a game of risk and percentages, and in their eyes, the risk is very low that Iran will attack Israel in the near future. Low risk means good deal. So why not move ahead with the deal? Low risk. That doesn't work for Israel. Israel cannot tolerate any percentage of a nuclear risk. Even 10% or even 1% sounds reasonable to the United States as a risk that can be absorbed. But the United States has nothing to lose. Israel does. For Israel, even the 1% risk is too high. 1% means the deaths of thousands of people, not percentage points. And that is why, come what may, Israeli Prime Minister Yair Lapid has made it perfectly clear that whatever the United States and other nations sitting at the nuclear negotiation table with Iran sign on to, Israel is not beholden to any deal or agreement with Iran.
Summertime and the living is easy. Three short jumping and the cotton is high.
I've also been thinking about summertime, as the masterful songwriter George Gershwin tells us in his aria he composed for his opera Porgy and Bess, and the living is easy. That song, which has been recorded over 25,000 times, sung by such greats as Louis Armstrong, Ella Fitzgerald, Janis Joplin, was written in the 1930s. In truth, for many years, summertime was just like any other time of the year, just hotter and more humid. The concept of summer vacation, of time off from school, of lazy days, or days spent in camps or camping in the woods, was not always a given. Summer vacations came into vogue in the United States with the rise of affluence and the emergence of a large middle class. Summer vacations were not instituted as the lore has it. Remember, these were not the case. It was not because parents needed their school-aged children to pitch in and work on the farms. That is a myth. When analyzed, it makes no sense at all. If there was time when more help was needed on the farm, it was during the planting season, which is springtime, or during the harvesting season, which is the fall, not during the steamy months of summer. In fact, summer vacations from school began in urban, not agrarian communities. And like many things, when summer school vacations became de rigueur in the United States, Europe and the rest of the world soon followed suit. Summer vacations became the model world over. Once upon a time, not so long ago, school was all year round. But in the big concrete cities like New York City, the summers were extremely hot and uncomfortable. Families with money escaped to the mountains where it was cooler, much as they do today. In those days, school was not compulsory. But when parents took their kids out of school to escape to more comfortable and cooler areas, the school system, by default, began to break down. It was a double whammy. Fewer students in the classrooms led to less effective schooling, and stifling hot classrooms led to lessened concentration. What we call in Yiddish, Sitzfleisch, or the ability to sit still and pay attention. And so schools ceased teaching during the summer. Air conditioning, which we all agree is one of the best inventions of all time, was not invented until 1902. In fact, I argue that the compressor is one of the most important of all inventions in the modern world. The same compressor used in refrigerators and freezers is used in air conditioning. That one technology has saved countless lives. By necessity, along with summer vacations, came the need to overhaul school systems around the United States, where education is supervised and overseen not by the federal government on the federal level, but rather by the states. That is, state by states monitor the educational system. So suddenly, compulsory attendance in schools, as well as a minimum day requirement for schools, began popping up. Public schools were established 100 years before the United States declared its independence. The first public school was Boys Latin in Boston, still around today, which opened its doors in April 15, 1625. Between 1852 and 1918, all 50 states passed laws requiring mandatory attendance in school. Massachusetts was the first, Mississippi was the last. In 1842, for example, New York required 248 days of school. Today, almost all states require 180. Nowadays, there's a formula, not for the last day of school, but for the first day. Barring teacher strikes, in Israel, let's say, like many European countries, schools will begin on September 1st. In the United States, most schools begin after Labor Day, usually the first week of September. The yeshiva world had its own variation on the theme. Their summer break is shorter than most. It begins with the 9th of Av and runs until Rosh Chodesh Elul. It's 3 weeks, that's it. When yeshiva resumes in Elul, it's called Elul Zman. Learning is less formal than it is for the rest of the year. Elul is a transitional month. During this period in yeshiva, students seek out appropriate study partners, chavrutot, and learn about the high holidays or other items of special interest. Real learning begins after Sukkot, when distractions are fewer and study is more intense. This year, the school calendar and the Jewish calendar are in sync. It's perfect for education. There's enough time between the start of the school year and the first break of the year, the high holiday break, for real learning to get underway. Traditionally, Elul is the time for each and every one of us to take stock in our activities, to evaluate the past and to prepare for the high holidays, for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. It's time to engage in self-critique and introspection, to examine our lives, our family life, and the life of our communities. And that time is upon us. Coming up next, Points of View. First up is a column from Ynet, and it was written by Ben-Dror Yemini. We've looked at him quite often. He's exceptional. It was written on August 20th, 2022. It's entitled, Why New York Times Still at a Loss to Explain What Prompted Rushdie Attack. Opinion? Media's insistence on claiming not to know devout Shiite Muslim and Iran admirers' motives for stabbing the Satanic Verses writer is a point of concern if our generation's intellectuals choose to ignore reality, to push agendas. We're in deep trouble. It's a very long subtitle, but it encapsulates the entire column. This is how Ben-Dror Yemini begins. Since the attempted murder of novelist Salman Rushdie in New York last week, media outlets across the board, especially the New York Times, have repeated the claim the perpetrator's motives for the attack is unknown. They claim that despite being aware that the assailant, Hadi Matar, is a devout Shiite Muslim who has expressed admiration for the Iranian regime, they also know that Iran's former supreme leader, Ruhollah Khomeini, issued a fatwa calling for the writer's death back in 1989. Still, the politically correct newspaper's editors insist on ignoring the correlation between these facts. Allow me to ask, could the perpetrator's motives be that he set out to fulfill the holy commands of his master, being a devout Shiite Muslim? No way, it can't be, the New York Times would have likely told me, pointing to the disinformation spread by TikTok and other social networks and media outlets. Ben-Dror Yemini explains that the New York Times is not alone, that we are all blinded by our perspectives. We reject ideas that do not agree with our narrative. He writes this and explains it in a beautiful way, but it doesn't justify the mistake. He writes, The blindness to the facts is not exclusive to Americans. It's embedded into us as humans. We obsessively repress any piece of evidence that could undermine the narrative we built for ourselves. This is true across all the political spectrum, in Israel as well. For the left, its inability to admit that the Palestinian Authority's constantly feeding incitement, just like the Iranian incitement led to the stabbing, almost murder of Rushdie. The incitement is leading to cultivation of terrorism. The so-called occupation could have been over years ago, but time and time again, Palestinians refused any peace offer that was in front of them. But it is not politically correct to tell the truth, just like the New York Times refuses to blame radical Islam for the attack on Rushdie out of some false sense of righteousness. As for the right, it suffers from blindness in its refusal to acknowledge that it's creating a binational reality in Israel that will bring the demise of the Jewish state. Those who say that any independent Palestinian entity would be a terrorist state are not wrong, but who said that in order to depart from the Palestinians, we must establish a state for them? Disengagement can be done while staying in control. For his conclusion, Ben-Dror Yemini writes, and this actually is very important because it gets to the heart of the essence of the tension. Somewhere between 0.5 to 1.5 million Americans of Iranian descent live in the United States. Most of them, in some way or another, escaped the Iranian regime and are usually not involved in the political field. They most likely will not riot en masse if the media denounces an Islamic radical who isn't even from Iran, but from Lebanon, for stabbing a world-famous writer. Despite this, the politically correct crowd continues to do more harm than good. It's happening in the United States, and it's happening here. It's very easy to affiliate this blindness to a crazy minority, but this is a trouble of many. Like almost anything and everything, Ben-Dror Yemini writes, this piece was insightful. What a great perspective. Next up is a column by Salman Rushdie, and it's entitled, Has Washington Recognized a Nuclear Iran? Subtitled, The biggest winner in the negotiations to resuscitate the nuclear agreement, hands down, is Iran. The column was published in the Jerusalem Post on August 27, 2022. Salman Rushdie is a United Arab Emirates political analyst and former Federal National Council candidate there. He begins by explaining that the United States seems to have changed their tune regarding Iran's nuclear program. The change is from preventing Iran to slowing down Iran's inevitable nuclear program. He writes, Statements by the United States officials in recent months indicate that the United States takes the idea of a nuclear Iran for granted. So the focus has shifted from preventing this risk from materializing to retarding it. The most recent of these statements came from the United States Special Envoy to Iran, Robert Malley, who recently stated that Iran is only weeks away from having enough material to build a nuclear bomb. He expressed hope that a nuclear agreement would be reached as soon as possible. In a television interview, Malley said that the situation today, as a result of a decision to pull out of the nuclear agreement, is that Iran is only weeks away from having enough fissile material to make a nuclear bomb. He added that an agreement would set Iran back several months in terms of possessing the material needed to manufacture a bomb. Rushdie continues making his point and explains that no one in our region wants to start a war or use military force against Iran, as long as they respect international law. But this is about American negotiating strategies that can only succeed if they rely on influential negotiating cards, if they balance the stick and the carrot effectively and decisively, and if they know how to use one another, when and to what extent. In conclusion, Rushdie writes, overall, it is clear that the signing of new agreements to revive the nuclear deal is inevitable. The Middle East is witnessing a new variable in regional interactions. It is possible that there will be a slow rapprochement between the United States and Europe, with Iran to pull it out of a sphere of influence of China and Russia. Therefore, the GCC countries must carefully consider what is happening around them and continue their current strategic and participatory options with all international and regional powers. This is the best way to safeguard their interests. This is just a great column, written by someone in the region itself. Coming up, commentary through cartoons where pictures tell the story. I want to show you 8 cartoons and memes today. Some are very funny, all lend a critical eye to our crazy mixed-up world. The first is a neon sign of a hamburger restaurant, but some of the neon lights are out. The name of the restaurant is Five Guys, but the F and the E are missing, leaving us with the I and the V. In Roman numerals, that means 5 turned into a 4. And the caption reads, "Looks like one guy quit." Very funny. Next up is a picture of a doctor measuring the waist of a very heavy person. The man tells the doctor, "Well, you see, the problem is that obesity runs in my family." The next frame has the doctor responding, "No, the problem is that no one runs in your family." That's funny. Play on the word run and family and problem. Third up is a famous painting. A mother sits holding a piece of paper. She looks so sad and collapsed against the wall. Her young daughter tries to offer comfort. The caption reads, "The arrival of the electric bill. Oil on canvas." I looked at my electricity bill and I was floored. And then I read a piece in the Wall Street Journal pointing out that 20 million Americans are in danger of having their electricity cut off because of lack of payment. These bills are just too high, no question about it. Next up is a meme about math. It reads, "The following was asked of mathematicians around the world. How do you write 4 between 5? The Chinese wrote, 'Is this a joke?' The Japanese wrote, 'This is impossible.' Americans wrote, 'The question is all wrong.' The British wrote, 'It is not on the internet.' And the Israelis wrote, F, capital I, capital V, E. That was very funny, ingenious. Now another funny meme. This one underscores how the way we say things shade the way they are perceived. Just cleared up some space in the freezer sounds more productive than I just polished off another pint of ice cream. It sure does. In this hilarious cartoon, a child gives his math test to his parents. The mother says, "Jason's watching too much news. He redacted the grade on his math test." That's hilarious. These 2 next cartoons are about the New York Times dropping their cartoonists. Really, there will no longer be any editorial cartoons in the New York Times, which ran only on their editorial page, printed in the New York Times. It's unbelievable. This has been a very serious topic for all cartoonists who have been drawing on this. In the first of these cartoons, the New York Times editor is reading his paper, and the headline reads, "No more editorial cartoons." We see a Taliban extremist who shouts, "I'll make sure you never have to see another cartoon I find offensive." The editor says, "Me too." The cartoon calls the 2 figures brothers in arms. It's a sad day when the New York Times can't and won't have editorial cartoons. Finally, this last cartoon, a cartoonist is tied to a stake. The stake is actually a drawing pencil. The New York Times is portrayed in the image of the venerable gray lady as she's pointing a gun at the cartoonist. Behind her stands Donald Trump. He's pointing a Gatling gun. And the caption reads, "Ready, aim, fired." Not fire, but fired. In a moment, more of my own perspective and a few predictions. Russian President Vladimir Putin signed an order increasing the size of Russia's armed forces from 1.9 to 2.04 million. This news was reported by Russia's RIA Novosti news service. The figure, which includes 137,000 increase in the number of military personnel and 1.15 million, to go into effect January 1st. The decision by Russia's president proves several important points and gives insight into Vladimir Putin's strategy and intention. Most importantly, it is now abundantly clear that Putin expects Russia to be at war for the near future. To implement that goal, Russia will need more soldiers and more military personnel. What is not clear is whether that war between Ukraine and Russia will be the only conflict that Russia will be engaged in, or if Putin has other conquests in his sights. U.S. Deputy Treasury Secretary Wally Adeyemo informed Turkey's Deputy Finance Minister Yunus Elitas that Russian entities and individuals are attempting to use Turkey to bypass Western sanctions that have been imposed on Moscow since their invasion into Ukraine. This information comes from the U.S. Treasury Department, which issued a statement indicating that, in a phone call, the two also discussed ongoing efforts to implement and enforce sanctions against Russia. The rationale behind this alert was the desire of the United States to make certain Turkey is not complicit in Russian end-around sanctions. It would make sense that Turkey might want to aid Russia. It is no secret that Turkey and Russia share many common goals and work together on many political levels. We've been thinking out loud about a lot today. Now that you know what I've been thinking, let me know what you're thinking. Email me at micah@jbstv.org. Tweet me at Micah Halpern. Tell me what you think. Before we end, let me leave you with one piquante piece of information. Did you know that while we have been speaking about math, there is actually Jewish math? The greatest of all Jewish mathematicians was Rav Levi ben Gershon, known as the Ralbag, or also known as Rabbeinu Gershon. The Ralbag was born in 1288 in France. He was the grandson of the Ramban, Nachmanides. While the Ralbag rarely discusses math in his commentary on Tanakh, on the Bible, he does devote attention to a famous verse in which Yam Shel Shlomo, the water container or pool that King Solomon built for the temple, is described as being 10 amot wide and 30 amot around. An amah is a biblical measurement. It's the distance between your tallest finger and your elbow. The average is 19.2 inches or 48 centimeters. The famous problem that the Ralbag deals with here is that according to the ratio of pi, 3.14, the pool's circumference should have not been 30 amot, but 31.4 amot. The Gemara answers the verse by saying it's an approximate measurement. But Ralbag gives another answer, and very good one at that. His answer is based on an earlier verse that states that the walls of the container were a hand's breadth thick. Okay? That means that when the verse speaks of 30 amot, it's referring only to the inner circle, the inner circumference of the Shlomo's container. So the Vilna Gaon, also known as the Gra, also a master of math, his math book, Yair Lapid, which means triangle, was published posthumously in 1834. The introduction of this book states that it was written to present the science of mathematics to Torah scholars so that they need not have to resort to non-Jewish sources to get answers. It is incorrectly said that the Gra invented the Kramer theorem because his last name was indeed Kramer. But the math theorem was actually devised by a Swiss mathematician, Gabriel Kramer. Thank you for thinking out loud with me, Micah Halpern. Let's think out loud again next week on JBS.